Some of you in the comments have been asking me to respond to videos by Useful Charts. Now, for those of you who don't know, Useful Charts has a ginormous subscriber base, and you can definitely understand why. His videos are normally very well researched and very well done. However, when Useful Charts strays into biblical matters, it can be a bit of a mixed bag. Kind of like the stocking that you got from your parents every Christmas time. Ooh, Reese's Peanut Butter Cups. Thanks, Mom. Oh, quarters. Thanks again, Mom. You can tell that Matt Baker is giving you the view of modern biblical critics, and you know how I feel about modern biblical critics.
You kids get off my lawn!
Since it's the Christmas season, I'm going to go ahead and review his video on the birth of Christ, since it's only had 1 million views. So gather around the Festivus pole and make yourself a cup of hot cocoa, because it's time for the airing of my grievances.
I got a lot of problems with you people. Now, you're going to hear about it.
Let's now turn to the New Testament. Although there are 4 Gospels, only 2 of them include stories about Jesus' birth. These are Matthew and Luke. In Matthew 2, verse 1, it says, "In the time of King Herod, after Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea," so according to Matthew, Jesus must have been born sometime before the year 4 BCE, because he was quite clearly born during the reign of Herod the Great. Now, before you ask, but how do we know that the name Herod here refers to Herod the Great and not one of Herod's sons, who also used the name Herod? Let me point out that later in chapter 2, Matthew specifically mentions Archelaus as succeeding Herod, and therefore we know that the Herod referred to in verse 1 is in fact Herod the Great. Now, you probably know the rest of the story, so I'll just quickly summarize it. After Jesus is born, some wise men from the east visit Herod and tell him that they have come to worship the newly born King of the Jews. Herod freaks out, thinking he's got a new rival on his hands, and orders all male children 2 years old or younger to be killed. Herod then dies soon after this. Archelaus then takes over, and Jesus and his parents escape to Egypt. So take note that the author of Matthew doesn't actually tell us how much time passed between the birth of Jesus and the visit from the wise men. Herod orders all male children 2 years old or younger to be killed. So the assumption is that it could have been as much as 2 or 3 years, which means that the typical nativity scene is not very accurate. Not only does the Bible not state that there were 3 wise men, it also makes it pretty clear that the unknown number of wise men were not actually present at the birth of Jesus. If Herod died in the year 4 BCE, this means that, according to the Gospel of Matthew, Jesus was likely born somewhere between 6 BCE and 4 BCE.
Alright, so far, everything's pretty spot on. I have no complaints. And I even really appreciate the fact that he brought out that the fact that nativity scenes are often wrong. When the Magi would have visited Jesus, he probably would have been a toddler. Since we're already talking about Matthew, I might as well throw in an interesting detail that the author of Matthew gets right that shows that he was very knowledgeable about the times and probably close up to the facts. Matthew 2:22 says, "But when Joseph heard that Archelaus was reigning over Judea in the place of his father Herod, he was afraid to go there, and being warned in a dream, he withdrew to the district of Galilee." This raises a natural question. Since Herod the Great was dead, it was only natural that his oldest son Archelaus would take the throne. But wait, why in the heck does this news about Archelaus cause Joseph to change plans and go into Galilee? Very astute question, Self. Why? Thank you, me. Well, the answer is that Herod the Great had died, and Archelaus had taken his place not long before March of 4 BC, when hundreds of thousands of Jews made the pilgrimage to Jerusalem to celebrate Passover. The Jewish historian Josephus tells us that as the feast approached, there was a clash between some angry Jews in the temple and a group of Roman soldiers, in which some of the soldiers were killed. In a panic, Archelaus played the "there's a new sheriff in town" routine and sent a group of armed horsemen to surround the temple. These soldiers had orders to not let anyone outside go in and not to let anyone inside get out. He then sent soldiers and slaughtered 3,000 Jews in the temple. Passover was canceled, which, as you can imagine, was a huge deal. Having fled Judea in order to escape from one homicidal maniac of a king, Joseph very understandably decided that going back into the domain of another homicidal king wasn't a good idea. Okay, so let's keep going, and now we're going to get into the controversy. Matt Baker is going to bring out our old friend, the census of Quirinius, to say that Luke made a historical error and that Matthew and Luke disagree on the date of when Jesus was born.
Let's now look at Luke. In Luke 1, verse 5, it says, "In the days of King Herod of Judea, there was a priest named Zechariah, who belonged to the priestly order of Abijah." It then goes on to talk about Zechariah's wife Elizabeth becoming miraculously pregnant, and then Elizabeth's relative Mary also becoming miraculously pregnant. However, two things are not clear. First, it's not clear which Herod he means, Herod the Great or Archelaus. Second, it's not clear how much time has passed between the statement, "In the days of Herod, there was a priest named Zechariah," and the story about Elizabeth and Mary becoming pregnant.
Okay, hold on. There is a major problem here.
I say, hold up, wait a minute. Something ain't right.
For starters, while I guess one could say that Luke doesn't specify which Herod he's referring to, and there were certainly a lot of Herods, it seems pretty clear to me that he could only be referring to King Herod the Great and not Archelaus. Well, why exactly is that? This is because Archelaus was actually never designated with the title king. Matthew only says that he was reigning as king or acting as king. And in agreement with Matthew, the Jewish historian Josephus tells us that Archelaus' claim to the throne was never formally certified by Caesar. Actually, that was one of the biggest gripes against Archelaus. He had already assumed the kingship over to himself before anything was official, and Caesar was not happy. So by contrast, Herod is referred to as Herod the King by Matthew and most likely by Luke here. The title Herod the King is attested by 1st century coins that bear inscriptions that mean King Herod, and in fact there was never subsequently a formally ratified king at Jerusalem, except during the 3 years of the life of Herod Agrippa I, which we learn again from our old buddy Josephus. Luke indicates that he knows this, for in Acts chapter 12 verse 1 he refers to Herod the king, and he knows the difference between Agrippa I, who died at the end of Acts 12, and his son Agrippa, who Paul testifies to in Acts 24. Furthermore, repeatedly in Acts, Luke shows a Jeopardy champion-like knowledge of who the local leaders were. For instance, in Luke 3:1, Luke tells us that Herod the Great decreed that his two sons were to be tetrarchs, one, Herod Antipas, to be ruler over Galilee and Perea, and the other, Philip, to be over Trachonitis. Josephus agrees, telling us how Herod Antipas was removed by the successor of Tiberius, and that Philip died in the 20th year of Tiberius. But he doesn't just get details of who the major bigwigs were, he also gets smaller details correct. He gets the proper designation of Gallio, who was a proconsul resident at Corinth. This reference nails down the time of the events to the period of the summer of 51 to the spring of 52, which was the brief window of his rule. He also says that Publius is referred to as the first man of the island in Acts chapter 28. We have inscriptional evidence showing that this was indeed the official title on Malta. Furthermore, Luke nails dozens of little details regarding the proper titles of local officials. He gets tons of these correct, which is not an easy thing to do without the help of Wikipedia or Google. Just pause the video here and take a look if you want to. I could easily multiply examples, but I think you get the point, and I'd like you to stay awake to hear the ending of this video. For Luke to get all these little details correct and suddenly make a big howler by calling Archelaus King Herod seems like a bit of a stretch. Okay, so let's keep going.
Which makes Luke chapter 2 all the more important. And Luke chapter 2 starts with some very clear chronological information. In verse 1, it says, "In those days, a decree went out from Emperor Augustus that all the world should be registered. This was the first registration and was taken while Quirinius was governor of Syria." It then talks about Joseph and Mary traveling to Bethlehem for the census and Jesus being born there. Which means that, according to the author of Luke, Jesus was born A, sometime when a man named Quirinius was governor of Syria, and B, sometime when a major census took place. Fortunately, both of these facts lead us to a very specific date. Remember what I said earlier about Archelaus being deposed and Judea becoming a Roman province? Well, at that point, Syria was already a Roman province. It thus already had a governor. And according to Roman records, that governor was a man named Quirinius. You see, when Rome took over Judea, the first thing Emperor Augustus did was send Governor Quirinius over from the nearby province of Syria to take a census so that they would know how much tax revenue they could get. It wasn't a census of the entire empire, and it wasn't a census that required people to return to their hometowns. That was simply never done. But it was a census that became deeply ingrained in the memories of first century Jews.
Okay, stop.
It's time to stop!
Luke is not saying that it was a census over the entire Roman Empire. What this verse says is that the whole oikumene, the whole land, was to be registered. Luke uses this term and nearly this very same construction in Acts 11:28, that there would be a great famine over the whole oikumene. But here it obviously means the land of Judea, not the entire Roman Empire. This is a huge overreading on Baker's part. Also, to say that a census never required people to return to their hometowns was just never done is simply false. On the contrary, there is some evidence that Rome would sometimes do so. In the 30s AD, as Tacitus tells us in the Annals, a rather warlike tribe, the Ceatae, residing in the Roman client kingdom of Cilicia, was pressed to conform with Roman usage by making a return of their property and submitting a tribute. Furthermore, there has been a discovery of a papyrus document containing a command in Greek from the prefect Gaius Vibius Maximus for all those in his area of authority to return to their own homes in Egypt for the purposes of a census. This census took place at around 104 AD. So there are major issues with what Baker is saying here. Let's go ahead and continue.
This is because it led to a major revolt under a man named Judas of Gamala, the founder of the Zealots. That revolt failed, but it set the stage for the Jewish-Roman tensions that eventually culminated in the destruction of the temple in 70 CE. So, yeah, the census of Quirinius was a pretty important event in Jewish history, and we know exactly when it occurred. It occurred in 6 CE, which was when Archelaus was deposed. So I think you see the problem. According to Matthew, Jesus was definitely born before the year 4 BCE. But according to Luke, Jesus was definitely born after the year 6 CE. So how do we reconcile these two dates? Well, in my view, we don't have to. Like most secular historians, I do believe that Jesus was a real historical person. However, I also believe that the gospel accounts are highly literary in nature and are more concerned with making theological points than with getting all the little details correct.
Okay, here's where I have a major problem. Saying Jesus was definitely born after the year 6 CE, according to Luke, is just way too strong of a claim. As I have already pointed out, Luke is very interested in getting the facts correct and is not just interested in making theological points only. The classical historian Colin Hemmer gives 84 examples of difficult minor details that Luke gets correct regarding local geography, customs, titles, as we've alluded to earlier, and even slang just found in Acts 13 through 28. Regarding the census, Hemmer says that the fact that Luke's background information can so often be corroborated may suggest that it is wiser to leave this particular matter open rather than to condemn Luke of a blunder. You can see my playlist on the reliability of the book of Acts for more details of Luke's accuracy. Also, this insistence that Luke must be saying that this census took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria and that it was the 680 census is highly problematic. It runs in opposition to Luke's clear assertion that John the Baptist was conceived during the time of Herod the Great, as we discussed earlier. Luke also shows very clear knowledge of the 680 census at its own time period because he mentions it in Acts chapter 5 verse 37. Read it for yourself and see. Furthermore, Luke has a number of definite indicators of the time of John the Baptist's ministry and when Jesus' ministry began. On these indicators, Jesus would have been way too young if Luke thought that he was born in 6 AD. Luke says that Jesus was 30 when he started his ministry. If useful charts is correct, Luke's interpretation of Quirinius and the census in chapter 2 verse 2 doesn't fit within the chronology that he talks about elsewhere. Also, this whole idea that Luke either invented the census or moved Jesus' birth too much later is just absolutely absurd. It's like using a steamroller in order to crack a peanut.
Anybody want a peanut?
That's a really bad impression.
If Luke wanted to force Jesus to be born in Bethlehem contrary to the fact, all he would have to do is have Mary and Joseph start out in Bethlehem and later travel to Nazareth. There was no need for him to invent the idea that Mary was from Nazareth and that they had to travel from there while she was pregnant down to Bethlehem and then back to Nazareth. And to invent a Roman census for such a purpose would be a wildly exaggerated plot device. Luke's deliberately connecting it falsely with Quirinius and placing it at a date that is in great tension with all of Luke's other own time indicators is just overwhelmingly implausible. Why even do something like that? Luke didn't have to mention Quirinius at all if he was inventing a census out of thin air. Now you might say, Eric, come on, you dishonest apologist, you. Luke is obviously trying to get Jesus to fulfill a prophecy here. Well, no, sorry, I don't think that dog will hunt. Luke does not show even the slightest awareness of any particular passages in the Old Testament that say that Jesus must be born in Bethlehem. Micah 5:2 is a famous passage about the Messiah being born in Bethlehem. Matthew references it, but Luke doesn't show any awareness of it at all. He may have known about it, or he may have not. Gospel writers generally aren't shy about applying Old Testament references to Jesus, so I don't think it's a good idea to attribute some sort of theological motive when we have no textual evidence for it. I think it's a bad idea to play the role of mind reader. So with all of this in mind, let's review Matt Baker's argument. 1. Luke has placed the census under Quirinius. 2. Quirinius was not governor until about 86. 3. Jesus was born during the reign of Herod the Great. And 4. Herod died in 4 BC. But as every serious student of the New Testament knows, 1 and 2 are really debatable. Point 1 arises from one way of reading Luke 2:1 through 2, but as a number of scholars have argued, the Greek will bear a quite different reading, that Quirinius, when he eventually became the governor of Syria, made use of the records from the aborted registration that drew Mary and Joseph to Bethlehem. This was John Calvin's suggestion and endorsed by scholars like George Rawlinson, Alfred Edersheim, and a number of others. The idea is that after the registration in the narrow sense took place, there was a hiatus a decade later when Archelaus was deposed and Quirinius took power in Syria and took control over Judea. This registration was used as the basis for the actual taxation. The verb egeneto does bear the meaning set in motion or come to fulfillment in other classical writings and is used in this manner by Luke himself in Acts 11:28. As for point 2, a number of scholars have argued for the plausibility that Quirinius was a special legate of Augustus in Syria in or about 5 BC. This alternative would be ruled out if we read the Greek term hegemon as having an absolutely rigid meaning, but we're not compelled to read it so woodenly, as Josephus routinely uses it loosely in the Antiquities, where Saturninus, the technical governor, and his associate Volumnius, who was not the governor, but appears to have been a special agent of Augustus, are both referred to by this title. Either of these approaches, denying 1 or denying 2, would completely undermine what Baker has to say in this video. There are other plausible alternatives that have been offered as well. Another option that some scholars have suggested is that Luke may have been mistaken, but only in a very narrow sense. Luke may be interpreted as this was the first of 2 censuses made when Quirinius was governor of Syria, thinking that Quirinius was hegemon of Syria twice based on a mistaken memory or reading the name Quintilius, since the hapless Quintilius Varus was, according to Josephus, governor of Syria around that time. In that case, Luke did indeed make a mistake, but it was a very limited and understandable one, and it certainly didn't mean that he invented the census or that this would make him an unreliable historian. I could go into even more details and options, but that would take a much longer video. This is a complicated topic over which much ink has been spilled. The translation of what Luke says about the census is genuinely difficult. This skeptic's translation is by no means just some obvious natural translation of the sentence. The skeptic's preferred translation, this was the first census and was taken when Quirinius was governor, is just one of multiple translations of an odd sentence that have been legitimately suggested. The bottom line is that we don't have to accept the idea that Luke was disinterested in getting historical facts correct, or that he made a blunder here. Useful charts just isn't really all that useful right here.